say, okay, 47, the Progressive Group, but what about the Calcutta Group? And the Calcutta Group already being the consequence of many, many decisions, actions, works which had been made before. So it seems to me that when you begin to look at this modern moment in India, you have to think about another very interesting point, which is that up till now, it's like, the museum, when you think about Shantiniketan, and we'll come back to that, and the development of this Indian modern, you begin to see that what has been considered in the Euro-American world as the canon, the rule, the model of the modern institution, the Museum of Modern Art, as a dispositive, meaning a building, a collection, an attempt to open an audience and an attempt to develop an audience in order to have more people, to extend the knowledge, also in order to open a polemical space, meaning that, people arguing, people agreeing on this work or not, and discussing, and the discussion is part of the life of the Museum of Modern Art project. When you would consider this dispositive on a global scale, you would see that this is not what happened, and that what has been always thought about as the model, as the rule, is more of an exception. And that when you would look at the development of the modern project, and especially art, the visual art project, in many different geocultural zones of the world, and I won't discuss too much the African side, which I don't know well enough, but when I would stay with Asian worlds and Arab world, for instance, Latin America being in between, you could say that the rule, the model, is not the Museum of Modern Art. The rule is more the Greek museion, meaning the Greek idea of a museum, which is not, it's not a building, it's not a collection, it's the free meeting of the muse, of the muses, because you had more than one. And of course, the muses today, or at the time of Tagore and his colleagues, it were more the muse, the intellectuals of the day. So the modernity, which is a modern project, which is articulated through the free meeting of people coming from very different backgrounds, discussing together, articulating. Of course, it would end with Shantiniketan, and Shantiniketan, you could say, okay, but it was in the depths of Bengal. No, because very, very fast in India, it became like the engine, because the people from Shantiniketan, they went to teaching into different schools which were created in India, but Shantiniketan was not an autistic space. So you had many people going to Shantiniketan, and it would be a very interesting project, the transcultural paper of Shantiniketan, where you had absolutely major artists coming from China. Xu Beihong spent 1 year in India, and Xu Beihong was very attentive to what was happening in Shantiniketan. Xu Beihong came back to China and was responsible for the opening of one of the major, up to now, schools of art in China, meaning I think it's CAFA, is because you had a rivalry, historical rivalry between Beijing and Guangzhou. Hangzhou, sorry, not Guangzhou, Hangzhou. And after you had all these people coming from Burma, Aung San was there, Effendi was there, and many other people I don't remember. So it's a very, it's a model which traveled very far and which was interpreted. Of course, when you travel, when you address the model, you complexify. Sometimes you misunderstand, and we all know that misunderstandings can be very creative too. So it seems to me that when you look again on a global scale, the model is less the Museum of Modern Art as it was understood in the late 20s, always beginning with a private collection and the idea that you will have more people benefiting from your collection, that you will encourage discussion, that you will encourage the meeting of the artists, and in space and collection, which will become an institution. And after we can discuss public-private, which is not the same in the States than it is in France, so it's another story. But this kind of functioning is very different from the museum. And again, when you look on a larger scale, you would see that many projects developed outside from Europe and America have followed more the, I don't know if it's a model or but it's the dynamic of the museum than the dynamic of the Museum of Modern Art. When you are in the Arab world, you might have wonderful, messy sometimes, but it can be messy. It can be messy in wonderful museums of archaeology, but you don't have many museums of modern art. And when you have, it's a complete failure. I mean, one I would mention, which is a disaster, is the Museum of Modern Art in Cairo. No inventory, work stolen, unavailable, etc., etc. And when you see what's happening these days, you have to come, and it will be another discussion, but you would have to come to the point that apart from private collections, and you do have amazing private collections of modern art in the Arab world, the only museum which is a public museum is with modern Arab art is Mataf in Doha, Qatar. Mataf being the ex-collection of Sheikh Hassan al-Thani, which is very regularly augmented, and which is not the whole Arab world, but which is a very consistent, well-articulated, and if you would ask me, I think it's a much more articulated collection than a Barjil, which is it's not clear what is modern, what is contemporary. We have to accept that on one thing, Sheikh Hassan al-Thani had been has always been very clear. He's not so interested in the contemporary. He's interested in the modern, and for reasons I find very interesting, he knows that this is the last moment in order to put together works and in order to keep part of the heritage. And after we could discuss why in Qatar, which is another subject. I'm absolutely open to questions, but it would, at this moment, it would deviate from my presentation and my point. And of course, when you begin to think about these different realities of the development of the modern, you come to the point, and here I will stay in India because I don't see why I should speak about China. I can compare, but you have so many interesting elements in the development of the modern in India. When you would begin to work, and when you stay in Shantiniketan, you have also to deal with this fact, which is not so often we know it, but it's one thing to know it and to understand what it meant and how and what kind of heritage and how you deal with the heritage. When you think about these artists, you are not dealing with artists who were expecting an exhibition in New York. Maybe a few were frustrated, but it's not, I think, the main point. You are not dealing with artists who were dreaming of being in a great museum. You are dealing with artists who had a vision, who had a commitment, who were working for a group of people who were absolutely convinced about what they had to do, and who understood that they would have a very, and this we have to be very careful, because we could say, but I think it's speaking too fast, a limited visibility. And of course, it's more complicated than that. And I think that when you look at the circulation of the works, the way the works were circulated by magazines or people coming, and after in a way, the legend of Shantiniketan, you would say that it's a very different modern visibility than you would have in a kind of a very big city center with a museum, with a magazine. Not that you didn't have your amazing magazine reviews and writing in Shantiniketan, but with all this kind of the modern dispositive of the Museum of Modern Art. It was different. And I think, of course, different means that not you should, but you could show these works in a very different ways. And beginning with the fact that there are some elements which are absolutely fascinating, and you think about how it can translate in a museum presentation. When you see all these postcards these people exchange, it's fascinating because most of the time, apart from Tagore and a few and the others sometimes. But Tagore was traveling de facto, traveling a lot. So he was using postcards, if I might say, the normal way. When you have a postcard, you send it to somebody. And it's so amazing, the number of postcards which have been redacted for exchanging, staying in the studio, writing an idea, a sketch. So, you know, it's a very, very interesting situation, this kind of a world which is, it's a project, it's here, it's there, and it's so intimate and it's so modest. You know, when you see many works, it's also something you have to come, how do you show that? You know, it's not like showing a big Picasso. You know, you see the many, many works by Beno Deba Mukherjee. I'm not speaking about the murals here, which are, of course, the major works. But you know, even if you come to that, what does it mean, a modern artist? Because he knew he was a modern, working in a situation where he knows in advance that it's not helping for international visibility. When you have a mural, by definition, the mural is not circulating, and the visual economy, the social economy of Shantiniketan is not, or was not, the visual and social economy of the Mexican Revolution. Very different level of publicity to the images you would devise. You are not in the center of a city in revolution. You are in a cultural village. So what does it mean for an artist to, well, Beckett would have said, I do my job. Who did their work? What does it mean in terms of formal but also ethical involvement? And this is all this you have to convey, because it's surely not the same, a modernity, which is, till a certain extent, built on this very early commitment, than modernity, which in a way was from the beginning. You go to the art school, you go through a gallery, you have a collector, you enter the museum. Sometimes it's tough, because it has not been a bed of roses for all of the modern artists. But, you know, it's a very different context of working. So how do you deal with that today? How do you work out this heritage? And I'm leaving aside, again, this very, very complicated story that it's Shantiniketan is in Bengal, and it's where it is. But you see this permeability to the number of cultural. It's not really, when you say influence, you always, it's like you are drawing an arrow. An arrow is oriented. And I don't believe in influence. I think it's always an arrow with two sides. You take and you give influences. I don't know any culture where it's just receiving and not doing anything. And in case of Shantiniketan, it's absolutely interesting to see the many, many trans-cultural dynamics which infused the local project. So it's also very interesting for when you would modelize, or when you would take Shantiniketan not as a universal model, but as a possibility for modern development, for art and culture, in many other non-Euro-American. And when I'm saying that, I'm simplifying, because I'm close to sure that when you are working more precisely with very different European or American situations, you will find situations where nothing was really organized through the city, nothing was really organized through the big machine of MoMA, or the before MoMA, Mrs. Dreyer and the others. It could be discussed. But when you come to non-Euro-American, it's much more often that this is the way, the dynamic. I prefer to speak in terms of dynamic. I think model is a little bit authoritarian for my test. So when you come to this point, it seems to me that, instead of being in this, we were speaking about Derrida before, so this kind of aporie that, it is, and what do you do? No, I think we are in a situation where these two moments, the fact that certain major museums of modern art are in a way unable to expose all of the modern, and they have to come to the point that there is one aspect of the modern they're able to show. When in India there is a big effort to be made in order to show, because if I would be when there is nothing to do and nothing to look at, but the situation is here is really it's very, you can't be, there is nothing desesperating. Maybe you are a little bit tired that things are not moving fast enough, and as we might be tired for the reasons in France at the moment. But it's really very important to think about the modalities of the presentation of the modern in a situation where you do have amazing collections. Because at the end of the day, what is quite impressive is that you have a certain number of major works outside from India, but compared to many other countries, you really have such a number of seminal works which are in India in different collections, whether they are public, and NGMA, Delhi, they have a very, very strong collection, and you have a certain number of private collections. I would identify as, and after it's a national problem and it's yours and not mine, but as I would identify as private collection with a national destiny. Meaning what it means, that one day when it's so massive and important, it's probably the destiny, if not necessarily to be exploded. So I think these days, it's a really on one end you have a certain number of very, very complicated problems to solve, because first the museum, how to organize, how to deal with a narrative. And a narrative is always a narrative with many, it's not something solid, it has to be like permanently discussed, improved, and so on and so forth. And it's the same, when people, I won't say whom, but somebody told me that there is not artistry in India. I won't agree. I think you have different methodology. You have maybe not as many people as you would like to have, but when when you do your work and your research, and at the end of the day, you have a consistent number of narratives, I would say, or points made by different generations of historians, and mainly art historians, and many different methodology, but you do have the discourses, and the point now is to articulate, and this can be something absolutely made at once, and there is one line. If you go to Paris and you look at the presentation of the collection we have, it's more and more complex. We are, instead of simplifying, we are complexifying more and more, because we are very aware of the diversity of the modern project we have in the collection. We are more and more aware of the fact that certain movements which have been very, very identified to Paris and to a French movement, when you look from close, you see through the genealogy of the artist, or the genealogy of the project, cultural project, which are de facto much more translocal and transcultural than we would have expected. You have many artists, they were in Paris, but they were bringing a very different culture than the one of artists who are supposed to be French school. École de Paris was full of people coming from very different parts of the world, and in a way, when you look carefully, you can say that École de Paris was like the ticket, like when you go in the subway, the ticket for entering a European avant-garde. But when you begin to deconstruct the École de Paris, it's a big mess. You have everything and nothing in the École de Paris. So we know that now. So for people who are often in Paris and know the collection quite well, we don't have any more École de Paris room, because we know that it doesn't work, or it's lazy. So it's been deconstructed, and we do have as well. And I think it's something which, from my point of view, was missing in New York in the Asia Society exhibition, the 1947 Progressist Group, a documentation, meaning that the works are not they stand by themselves, but at the same time it's very important, especially for a non-Indian audience. But I think in India you might have, as in Paris, we have many people who have no clue that Picasso came at a certain time, but been born in Spain, for instance. You need a certain level of documentation in order to make people aware of the complexity, because the 1947 group is really built of individualities who had very different histories in terms of forms. I don't like to speak about style, but in terms of formal project, you see that one by one, they had very different projects with maybe exception of very, very specific and sometimes very short moments. You know, when you would say that Sosa, Padamsi, you have sometimes, or even Ram Kumar, you have something similar, but it's for a very short time with human figures. The portraits, this kind of very, very strong figure, they all do at a certain moment. But you could say the same from other avant-garde, where at a certain moment you have a kind of a common point in between a few individuals, especially when these individual artists are meeting together, discussing together, living together sometimes. So, meaning that it's not so uncommon, but what is really not so often is kind of avant-garde group which has a project which is maybe contingent project. Or what did they want? They wanted to be modern, they wanted to be thin, they wanted to be taken seriously, they wanted to be exposed. Okay, and if it's enough, you can tell me, but if you look at the formal project and you look one by one, it's absolutely diverse. And when you see after the continuation, so what these people did, the artist, after the group dissolves, and then it happened many times, it's a very, very